We will now consider log number 4967 by Mr. Luttrell. For what purposes does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please distribute the amendment without objection? The reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair and I recognize the gentleman from Texas for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would prohibit any funds to furnish, export, or sell, transfer, cluster munitions or its technology. And I want to thank the young lady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for joining me on this. Cluster munitions have a documented failure rate. These exploded bombs become de facto landmines, injuring and killing civilians, including children. Long after conflicts has ceased, the Cluster Munitions Monitor of 2023 reported that over 96% of cluster munition casualties in recent years have been civilians, and 2/3 of those being children. And in 2025, we have technologies that you can launch from a rotor wing or a fixed wing aircraft. You can probably launch it from here and park it on a license plate. And when the advancements of drone technology and swarm technology, you can touch anything, anywhere, with no residual effect, i.e. killing our babies. In my personal opinion, having seen cluster bombs in action, that's one of the things I wish we could disinvent. I know Ms. Jacobs and I probably stand alone on this, but I honestly think this is a valued effort. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair and I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you do not stand alone. As the co-chair of the Unexploded Ordnance and Demining Caucus, I am very proud to support this amendment offered by Representatives Jacobs and Luttrell that would prohibit the production, use, and transfer of cluster munitions. These indiscriminate weapons litter small bombs over large areas with little control over where the explosives falls, posing significant risks to civilians in the area. Cluster submunitions have a very high failure rate, between 2 and 40%, either failing to detonate or breaking apart in the air, and unexploded bombs or fragments can remain volatile for years. This prolongs the risk to civilians for years after fighting stops, particularly a risk to children. More than 100 countries have already banned the use of cluster munitions because of the disproportionate risk they pose to civilians, and it's time for the U.S. to do the same. So I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment, and with that, I yield.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I appreciate my colleagues' effort to put this bill forward. It's the continual argument back and forth. There's a moral argument to talk about what cluster munitions result in, but on the other side, the moral argument is what do we do to prevent adversaries from using cluster munitions? The way to deter that is to make sure that you have the ability to use that. The dud rate on our cluster munitions is incredibly low. Not fail-proof, but incredibly low. We know, too, that when we have low weapons magazine capability, as we have today, we want to make sure we have everything there at our disposal to make sure that we're deterring our adversaries. These munitions, as objectionable as they are, do allow us to make sure that when necessary, we're able to defend our interest. And we want to make sure, too, that we're helping our allies. The munitions that we transfer are ones with, as I said, very, very low failure rates. And by transferring these dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, the DPICMs, we preserve our limited 155 stockpiles, which today is incredibly low, and we are able to at least create the deterrence there. And folks said, well, you know, you can use other means to deter. Remember, deterrence is about using the same level of threat that keep your adversaries from even being tempted to use this. If you use other threats that are greater, you end up escalating those back and forths. I would argue that if you want to create the largest potential to deter adversaries from using cluster munitions, you have to be able to say, if you use yours, we will use ours. That idea, and we heard it earlier with nuclear arms, we heard the idea of mutually assured destruction is a very, very strong deterrent. I want to make sure, first of all, that we are using the weapons that we have in our inventory to defend U.S. interest, understanding the moral arguments on both sides of this, but I want to make sure, too, that we still have the deterrent effect to deter our adversaries from using these, and two, when we have challenges with weapons magazines, that we don't limit ourselves in the ability for us to be able to protect our interests around the world. I know there's a lot of back and forth in this. There are valid moral arguments to be made on both sides. Listen, I respect my colleagues in bringing this up. It's a continual effort. I appreciate my colleague from the great state of Texas and his passion for this. But I just want to make sure, too, that we're looking at all the impacts of this proposed ban on cluster munitions from United States stockpiles.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Takuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of Representative Jacobs and Luttrell's amendment to ban cluster munitions. Cluster munitions aren't deterrents. They're indiscriminate killers. And while not cluster munitions, Hawaii and the Pacific Islands understand, sadly, the pain and frustration of unexploded ordinances. Looking in at your ancestral homeland where you can no longer live or walk. Every new discovery, and they come often, a scary reminder that when it comes to UXOs, the dangers of war live on to haunt generation after generation. Now, times this by 100 in terms of impact, the terror, the harm that cluster munitions have on people and communities around the world. And that is why this amendment is so important. Due to the high failure rates of these munitions, and let's be clear, low failure rates still kill. These exponential amounts of unexploded ordinances that litter the world right now as a result of these bombings kill and maim primarily civilians, as was mentioned, making up 96% of all casualties, including and especially children who are likely to pick up these unexploded ordinances. It's the casualties after the war, with thousands losing life and limb every single year. We've spent billions cleaning up cluster munitions from battlefields. Most of our allies, as have been mentioned, banned these munitions by signing on to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, recognizing their use as a violation of international humanitarian law. The future of warfare is not cluster munitions. It's drones, other unmanned vehicles, cyber, missile defense, electromagnetic warfare. We all do want lethality. We want deterrence, but let's focus on platforms that truly reduce civilian harm and actually hit their intended targets, and not innocent victims that happen to be walking through a field. That means not doubling down on these damaging and unnecessary munitions. That means banning these altogether in terms of cluster munitions. Thank you again to the sponsors of this amendment, and I ask that all join us in supporting this amendment's passage. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this amendment. It is important to point out that the United States is not part of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Prohibiting funds for or the transfer of cluster munitions would not only limit American capability, but Ukrainian ability to push back war criminal Putin with his mass murder of civilians invading Ukraine. Russia is currently utilizing every weapon in their arsenal, including cluster munitions and possibly including chemical weapons, to murder civilians and hit civilian infrastructure. Prohibiting the transfer of cluster munitions would handicap Ukraine, and its biggest beneficiary would be war criminal Putin. The U.S. should not restrict Ukrainian ability to defend themselves when they are the ones requesting these types of munitions for defense of Ukrainian sovereignty to achieve peace through strength. There are legitimate issues of unexploded cluster munitions, but a reminder is Ukraine is requesting them. Also, compared to Russia, which is not part of the convention, there are unexploded ordnance are high from the Russian Federation. The U.S. has worked responsibly to lower the rates of unexploded cluster ordinances, and Russia doesn't do as Ukraine, in that Ukraine is also aware of areas they are utilizing, which will be helpful once the conflict is over, to reduce and eliminate the number of exploded ordnance. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Luttrell, for co-leading and leading this effort with me. I appreciate his efforts. Look, most U.S. allies, including most NATO members, have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but we haven't. And that's a mistake because these weapons leave behind unexploded landmines that maim and kill civilians indiscriminately. In 2021, the Landmine and Cluster Munitions Monitor found that over 97% of casualties from cluster bomb remnants were civilians, and 2/3 of those were children. 2/3 of those were children. And that's because these deadly weapons don't look like weapons, but they do look interesting to kids, so when kids find these weapons in trees or in the water or simply on the ground, they try and pick them up, and they can end up losing a limb or their life. And we know even our cluster munitions dud rates are consistently higher than expected in war zones. But this is not just a moral argument, it is a strategic and financial one. These weapons are incredibly costly. Since 1993, the United States has spent nearly $5 billion on cleaning up these weapons. As of last year, we were still paying to clean up cluster munitions the United States dropped in Laos because they were still killing civilians. Continuing to transfer cluster munitions is not just a moral stain on the U.S. reputation around the world, but a fiscally irresponsible one for years to come. And to my colleague's argument about deterrence, imagine saying we should use chemical weapons to deter chemical weapons. I mean, it makes no sense because it makes no sense. We shouldn't just do something just because Russia is also doing it and doing it worse. That's like the first thing we teach kids. No amount of guardrails for cluster munitions are enough. We need to ban the transfer of these weapons entirely, and now is our opportunity to do that, to do the right thing and protect civilians, especially kids. Now is our chance to restore our reputation, to live up to our values. This is a bipartisan amendment. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want, first of all, to acknowledge the very valid and serious concerns that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have raised with this amendment. And I am all for a treaty banning cluster munitions that we can all sign on to. But we can't unilaterally disarm, especially in the midst of the brutal war in Ukraine. I also want to appreciate my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for citing, and I quote, the strong arguments that we heard earlier explaining the importance of mutually assured destruction and how that's critical for deterrence, which I think is the strongest case I've heard yet for my amendment to restore that bipartisan language to our strategic defense policy, which unfortunately he voted against. But the point is that Ukraine wants these weapons for their own territory. And who better to make that determination than them? We all care about kids. You know what kills kids in the U.S.? Firearms. Firearms are the leading cause of death for children and adolescents ages 1 to 17. In fact, one of the worst things you can do to increase that risk is simply having guns in your own home. But I don't think you want this committee to come and tell you whether or not you can have guns in your home in Texas, even though it would statistically help your kids. But that's what we're telling Ukraine. That's what we're saying to Ukraine. In this case, the cluster munitions have demonstrably helped them in the conflict. They have made the tough decision, the tough determination that they are willing to take the risk of casualties from unexploded ordnance in order to win this war, to protect their kids from Russia, a country that's already kidnapped thousands of them and is trying to kill thousands more on the battlefield. So I think we should leave that decision to them and support them however we can in this war. Very valid concerns, but in this case, the tough decision is the right decision to get them the weapons that they need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleagues' compelling arguments. And but for Ukraine, I'd probably be with them. But the problem is Russia is doing what they're doing in Ukraine. And the argument about unexploded ordnance on the battlefield is a legitimate one, except the more Russia succeeds, the more unexploded ordnance there is going to be in Ukraine. Russia has used cluster munitions throughout Ukraine indiscriminately. They've also mined the living crap out of Ukraine. There is going to be unexploded ordnance in Ukraine for generations, which is horrific. And if there was some way to stop that or have prevented that, I'd be all in favor of it. But given what Russia is doing there, Ukraine needs everything they can to try to stop them. The longer the war goes on, the more unexploded ordnance you're going to have. And oh, by the way, the more exploding ordnance that you're going to have. We struggled to provide the weapons that Ukraine needed to defend themselves. We had cluster munitions, and the decision was to transfer them to Ukraine. You want to make this about other stuff beyond Ukraine? I think there may be a strategic argument for that. But in Ukraine, they needed them. And when you are threatened by Russia, you need them. And they were transferred as a result. It's worth noting, as far as I know, we are not actually making cluster munitions anymore. These were munitions that we had, so we're not wasting money on them. And then also, it is interesting on the treaty to not use cluster munitions. One of the countries that just withdrew from that treaty was Lithuania, because they faced the threat that Russia's coming at them. So I'm with you. We want to live in a world where cluster munitions aren't used. I think the U.S. should try to strive to achieve that. But if this amendment were to pass, Ukraine would be less able to defend itself against Russia dropping all manner of ordnance all over Ukraine, unexploded and otherwise. So as a practical matter, this amendment weakens Ukraine and strengthens Russia in this current moment, and therefore I cannot support it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to speak on Mr. Luttrell's amendment? Seeing none, a question occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Luttrell. So many as are in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Hearing the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not a recorded votes requested. Recorded vote will be postponed.